Hello, and welcome to the next episode in our How to Apply IFRS 16 video series. I'm Jessica Taurae. I lead our global technical team for lease accounting under IFRS. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Nick Croft. Nick works in our valuations team, helping clients to calculate discount rates. So today we're going to focus on how clients calculate the discount rate. The standard says you should use the rate implicit in the lease if it's readily determinable, and if not, then to use the incremental borrowing rate. In practice, we're seeing lots of clients having to use the incremental borrowing rates. So Nick, where should a client start?
I think it's probably a good place to start is to categorise leases into different types, so separating property leases from, say, car leases, to look at 10-year leases versus 5-year leases, and try and come up with as many buckets of similar assets as possible. Ultimately, the standard's meant to be applied to each individual lease, but in practice that's unlikely to be practical. So having similar leases together to apply a single discount rate to those is a good starting point. Otherwise, I think in terms of the IBR, two key things to think about are firstly, in the basis for conclusions, it says that the discount rate is intended to reflect the pricing of leases generally. It also says that it wouldn't expect the Standards Board wouldn't expect large differences between the implicit rate and the incremental borrowing rate in most cases. And the reason for that is because both rates reflect four similar things. Firstly, the length of the lease. Secondly, the credit standing of the lessee. Thirdly, the asset or the underlying collateral. And fourthly, the economic environment. So those four elements, I think, are a good way forward in beginning to come up with an incremental borrowing rate.
And so if I think about a big multinational group that's going to have lots of leases all across the world, how would you suggest they come up in thinking about things like regional information and that in terms of factoring into the incremental borrowing rates?
Well, I guess going back to those four component parts, a good starting point as a sort of reference rate is to look at risk-free rates in those different countries or swap rates if they're available. And then that obviously begins to build in any country risk premium or reflects the economic environment as required by the standard. Mm-hmm. Moving on from that, you obviously need to reflect the credit rating of the lessee, and the standard is clear that it needs to be lease specific. So the discount rate for a parent company may well be different from a subsidiary company. Or a practical example I've had recently is there were long ground leases on property, so very secure leases just on the land, versus shorter leases that have far more exposure to the sort of operations of the property involved. So you'd expect those two to have different discount rates. Also need to reflect the asset-specific nature of this, and that's probably the most judgmental element, and whilst implicit rates might be judgmental, this is also an area that is judgmental for IBRs. But there does need to be some reflection of whether the lease is on a property or whether it's on a vehicle or whatever.
And with regards to sort of the credit spreads, you mentioned that it needs to be entity specific. And presumably if there was a parental guarantee or something like that in place for the lease, then you would factor that into equally in determining the incremental borrowing rate for that particular entity.
Yes, that's correct. If there was a parental guarantee, then that would take you back to the parent's rate, I think. But yeah, generally can see quite a range of discount rates for a single company in some cases, and it may be quite difficult to quantify those credit spreads, particularly if they're small entities, and it's a case of trying to work out an implied credit rating for that entity and then looking at traded debt with a similar credit rating to come up with the credit spreads.
And is there anything else that companies should be considering, things like starting with property yields, for example, and how those get adjusted?
Yes, well, I think that's helpful in dealing with the asset-specific piece because, as I mentioned, that is fairly judgmental. But in the case of property, then property yields are a good measure of the expected return, particularly if you've got a short lease, say a 5-year lease, and there are no rent reviews, and the reversion is expected to be a continuation of the use of the property, then the property yield is likely to be a helpful measure of the discount rate in the lease. Also, you could look at property borrowing costs in terms of secure property borrowing costs, but that information is not always readily available. And obviously the key issue there is typically it's just on senior debt, or you may get a junior debt component as well, but it doesn't give you 100% loan to value exposure on the asset.
And in the current environment, where interest rates, at least in the UK, are fairly low, are we seeing sort of incremental borrowing rates and rates implicit in lease being sort of a similar nature, or are we finding that they are slightly different in that sense?
No, so the implicit rates, which should be a reflection of the pricing of the lease, are generally a bit higher typically than incremental borrowing rates at the moment, and obviously quantitative easing has pushed all borrowing rates down, but also implicit rates, but maybe not to the same degree. But certainly if you've got a AAA credit rating, they may have a very low IBR, which could be quite a bit lower than the property yield. And I guess one area where some caution is needed on that front is if you've had property leases in the past which have been on the cusp of being a finance lease previously but were an operating lease, is that if you do put a very low discount rate on those, you end up with the risk of producing a higher value for the right of use asset than the fair value of the asset itself if you actually owned it.
Of course, that's a consequence of how you do the transition approach.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nick.
Okay.
So just to summarise, IFRS 16 tells us some factors to incorporate in the incremental borrowing rate, but doesn't really specify how to actually calculate the rate. We're seeing a few different approaches in practice, such as starting with a current borrowing rate, or looking at government bonds, or looking at property yields, and then adjusting each for the specifics of each lease. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join us for the next video, and for more information, please visit pwc.com/IFRS 16.